Hi there, I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Text Podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here every 2 weeks, talking about two different texts from the Bible. This is our second season. It's about the miracles of Jesus. This is episode 2, and it's called, Did He Just Spit?
So, David, we opened up our Miracles series by really landing on Luke 4 and how that really set the frame for how Jesus was going to engage with his world and some of the things he was going to try and achieve there. Found that so helpful. We're now going to start jumping into some of the actual miracles, and we're starting with this beautiful story of the man who is blind, healed at a place called Bethsaida. It's in Mark chapter 8. So do you want to read that for us, and then we'll get stuck into that?
Let's do it, John. So verse 22 of Mark chapter 8, it says, They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a man who was blind and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the man who was blind by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, Do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. So once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, Don't even go into the village.
Wow. Beautiful, isn't it?
It's a story. I again, it's one of these stories, John. I try and locate myself into the story. The opening, there's that line when he spit on the man's eyes. I always put myself in the context of, is there something missing from the story here? Was Jesus like hold on, this is going to be a bit weird? Okay.
Yeah. Our listeners should know that is a pretty literal translation there. He spit on his, it's not like he spit on his hands and rubbed them in his eyes. It's like he's literally spit on his eyes. And maybe that's why Jesus took him outside the village to do that. You're sort of thinking, was there a bit of strategic sense there? Right, I'm about to do something that looks quite gross. So I'll take him outside so nobody puts this on social media or TikTok or something. And so there is, because I've often marveled, again, we've leaned into that conversation, haven't we, that Jesus isn't just healing people, but there is a sensitivity to the situation they're in. There is often a sense and here's one of those moments that seems to reflect a sensitivity to the extremity of this particular context, because I think there's some beautiful ideas tucked away in the text here that aren't immediately obvious, but really, once we see them, they stand out as quite dynamic.
Just picking up on what you were saying just there. So in Luke chapter 4, where we began this season, you've got the people who are blind are going to receive their sight. And this is going to be the kingdom is coming. This is deliverance has come. God's Messiah is amongst us. And then now our first kind of miracle story that we jump into, it's Jesus healing a man who is blind, but doing it privately and not performing a big show. There's a little bit of us going, wait a minute, Jesus, I thought that these miracles were supposed to show that you're the Messiah. And now we've got Jesus kind of doing it privately just with his disciples, keeping away from the show and away from the aggrandizement of this, which I think goes back to the second aspect that we introed with this season, that Jesus humanizes everybody he encounters, even if society stigmatizes and separates. Jesus seems to be concerned about the man, which is beautiful.
It is, and another little maybe this is me reading something into it potentially, but I love the fact that Jesus says at the end there, "Don't even go into the village." So Jesus isn't even wanting to sensationalize the man. All right, he's not right. Okay, now that you can see, like, you're a walking advert for me, just go and blast this everywhere. It's like Jesus is downplaying this. And of course, there's lots of theories why he does that and lots of conversation around that. But one of the little ideas I love that may or may not be substantiated, but I'll throw it out there, is that Jesus downplays this in terms of public announcement, because he is concerned about the man. This is about this man's now got to start putting his life together. He's got to find a job now. He's got to get back into his world, and he doesn't simply want this man to be a poster boy for this event. He wants this man to get his life back and actually enjoy the fullness of the kingdom of God. There's a sensitivity to that moment as well. Whereas we would be prone maybe in the 21st century to make it a bit of a wow event and maybe ride on the back of it for a while. I hope I'm not being too cynical there, but I've seen it done.
One of my favorite interpreters of Mark chapter 8 is Richard Hayes, and he has just this line where he says that Mark, when he's telling you this story, Mark is also, he says, Mark has crafted the story to ensure that you understand how Jesus is a miracle worker. So if you just hear the stories of Jesus as a miracle worker, you might jump things. And so then Hayes says this: those who perceive Jesus as a purveyor of power, whether supernatural or political, have failed to understand him. Right?
Very good.
So Jesus has an opportunity here to go into the middle of the village and go, look, the Messiah has come, and I'm going to prove it to you right now by healing a blind person. You have never seen this happen before. You remember Isaiah. This means that the Messiah is here. But instead, you get the exact opposite from Jesus. We're going to head off into a little quiet spot outside the village. There will be no scene. There will be no fanfare. And actually just go home quietly after this and just get on with your life and see what happens. So there's this real symptom of Jesus, again, upsetting the apple cart, kind of disrupting our views of what the Messiah is going to look like. At the minute, in the back of my head, I have another miracle in mind in John chapter 6 when Jesus feeds the 5,000. We'll jump into that miracle in this season as well. But just as a little spoiler of it, when he does that, what do the people try and do? It says they try and make him king by force. So, and Jesus gets out of there, walks across the water to get away from it all. So there's this constant theme that Jesus isn't looking to leverage this miraculous ministry for power in the way that we would ordinarily understand that, which I think is powerful.
Oh, I think it's absolutely profound. And I think it's a challenge, and I think it's something that we should take note of and just be sensitive to. There are obviously moments where Jesus does things in a very public context. So we're not saying this is the only way he does it, but the fact that Jesus does something like this in what seems to be a more private context is an insight that we should not ignore. And we should be open to the sensitivity of that dynamic and what perhaps Jesus is saying and doing through it.
I would want to just spread the net even a little wider, John, and like Hayes' little comment in the quote that I read there, whether supernatural or political. Like there are many ways that Christians can leverage power, and there are many ways that we can try and establish ourselves as like, whoa, look at us. And something in this story and many of Jesus' stories that will just tell us that that's not quite how Jesus wants to go about doing things, isn't it?
So good.
There's also a little clue that I just want to mention now, and we'll come back to it. But there's a little clue just a few verses before this. Mark chapter 8 almost needs to be read in totality, but I think that would make us need to change the name to like 14 texts or something like that, because there's a lot of stories. But you have this miracle of the feeding of the 4,000, and then there's this beautiful irony that so Jesus has fed 4,000 people, and they get in a boat and they're heading across somewhere else, and then Mark just says to us the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, which I think is hilarious. Jesus has just fed all of these people, and somehow they've got no bread. But then Jesus says to them, hey, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod, which again seems to be a little watch out for the pursuit of power, watch out for the pursuit of these things. The disciples miss the point of Jesus' little lesson and decide, oh, he only said this because we've not got any bread. And Jesus says to them, why are you talking about bread? Like, I'm trying to teach you something here. And then he says, do you have eyes but fail to see? Right? And just note that Mark is doing something here, right? That he's, do you have eyes but don't see? And then Jesus unpacks a little of explanation to the disciples, and then they turn up in Bethsaida and look who they encounter straight away.
Amazing.
A person who can't see. right?
Amazing.
But perhaps we want to jump in a little deeper into then this story, but just be aware of the storytelling of the gospel writer here, that he's giving you a little hint that there's something coming up, and you're going to want to pay attention to it.
Indeed. And I think for anyone who listened to the previous episode on Luke 4, we did hint strongly at that the gospel writers seem to really get Jesus. They understand who he is, of course, and what he's about, what he's trying to achieve. And therefore, there are moments when each gospel writer will connect some ideas together. Sometimes they are chronological and they fit chronologically, but sometimes they're programmatic. They're events that happen, and the gospel writer themselves are putting them together. This is one of those beautiful moments. And of course, as we're going to see, not just before, but after. There's a gorgeous after as well, isn't there, on this, which I can't wait to get to, David. I'm almost falling over with excitement because I can't wait to get to it. But David, let me just ask you a question. As I was stumbling through this story in my own sort of Greek reading, trying to see if there's anything under the surface, I saw something, and I know you've got some wonderful thoughts around this, but verse 23, it says, Jesus spit on his eyes. And the word for eyes there is uma. And yet in verse 25, it says, so you have this little awkward in-between moment where Jesus spits on his eyes, puts his hands on him, and then says, do you see anything? And the man says, I see people. They look like trees walking around, which I love this, because you're going, hold on, has Jesus not done this right? Or what's going on here?
Yes.
And then verse
it's the
25,
only miracle of Jesus that he seems to have to take 2 goes at.
Let's have two shots at this, which is a bit of an encouragement to us all. But then verse 25 maybe leans into something else, because it says, once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Ophthalmos, different word. Now, are we potentially reading too much into that? But the fact that we've got one word in verse 23 and another word in verse 25, is there something more going on here potentially than meets, forgive the pun, than meets the eye and the surface of the text? This
is where I think this passage gets quite exciting, and a lot of translations. And now let me be fair to the translations, because a lot of lexicons do the same. So the dictionaries that the translators are using do the same. This word oma is not the regular ordinary word that we would use for eyes in the Bible. It seems to, from my research, it seems to more relate to the notion of eye socket. So it's a little interesting to deal with, because it's not a very common word, and that's not surprising. You and me don't talk about eye sockets very often, but the word eye is in kind of common parlance. But ordinarily, if you were reading this, you would assume the basic idea is eyes would be ophthalmos, exactly as you say. That's the second word. Now, why I think that's interesting is that Mark chooses an awkward word that seems to, in other places in the Greek literatures, it doesn't really appear much in the biblical literature, but in the other Greek literatures, it appears to mean eye sockets, right? Now, I think that's quite fascinating now, because there's a couple of things going on here. Jesus has just asked the disciples, do you have eyes but don't see?
Indeed.
Is it possible that we're actually encountering a man here who physically doesn't have eyes, right? Yeah. Now, the text doesn't give us much to go on why that would be the case, except that what seems to be happening is that Jesus is spitting into the man's eye sockets. So there's almost a sense of a kind of creation miracle happening here, that Jesus is forming and making something. And so then, and it feels like that what happens is this sort of first kind of creation is to create eyes for the man. And then the second time, Jesus now puts his hand on the man's eyes. Where have they come from? Right? Now, does that make sense? Now, there's another way of reading it, which says that maybe the man did have eyes, but his whole face was damaged somehow as a result of something like you're generally having to work with big gaps in the text. But it seems that the most accurate way to read the Greek is that you've got eye sockets and then eyes the second time. So it's not so much that Jesus takes a go at trying to heal the man, doesn't do a great job, so tries again. It seems there's actually a 2-stage healing. There's a healing of whatever happens, of whatever is going on with the man's eye sockets. And now there's a healing of the man's eyes themselves. I'm personally kind of tending towards thinking that Jesus creates eyes in this. That's what you're supposed to read into this. But, you don't need to go to your death on that interpretation.
No.
But there's definitely a progress of there's a one-stage problem and now there's a second-stage problem. And the fascinating thing is that sets the man up that he's kind of, okay, you've kind of fixed the problem a little bit here, Jesus, the first time, but we're not quite there yet. I don't. Yeah. And the second time, he sees everything. And there's a really key little word that's going to be important to us. Clearly, right?
Yes,
he sees things properly. So I don't know if does that help the reader, do you think, John?
Well, I mean, there's a sense in which we've talked about before. You can read the Bible on the surface and there's gold on the surface, and then you drill under the surface and you find a couple of bits of gold. The last thing we want to do is become guilty of eisegesis, of reading stuff in there. But
yes,
I think with what goes before, do you have eyes to see? I mean, it's just, and then the first person Jesus encounters when they sort of arrive in Bethsaida is a guy potentially, literally, with no eyes. The other thing that really helps me is that it would explain, I know this is quite cultural or maybe not, but it makes it feel slightly easier that Jesus spit into or on the eye. If there's nothing actually there, you're sort of spitting into a socket. I know that might sound a bit distressing to some of our listeners, but somehow that sort of makes sense to me, like spitting into an actual eye rather than spitting into the socket sort of makes sense. And the other little thing I think it connects it to is verse 25, David. It says, "And he was restored." So this idea of back to original constitution, back to what it should have been. I think it is. It's this beautiful idea of the restoration of something that was previously constituted. I love that sort of thought. So it seems to lean into potentially this dynamic, creative mirror, which then explains the two stages, which for those lovely followers of Jesus out there thinking, oh my goodness, Jesus like botched it up first time round. Well, maybe or maybe not. Maybe the first thing Jesus is doing is creating the actual eye. And then the second thing is giving that new eye or new eyes a clear focus. He saw clearly, as opposed to seeing in a fog. And I love that. I think to me, it doesn't fundamentally change the story, but it potentially adds something really amazing. And of course, if we're also leaning into these wonderful miracles also having a message to them, then could it be there will be sight created in those who at this moment cannot see and are not expected to see the Messiah, but they're going to see the Messiah because Jesus, through his life and ministry, will, as it were, create the facility for those who couldn't see before now to be able to see. And I do like the sort of layers on that, David. I do. I think that leans into the wider interpretation of the miracles.
And again, that idea of restoration, his sight was restored, not an interpretation that you're going to go to your grave over, but this man isn't like, so in other situations in the New Testament, you encounter a person who is blind and they were born that way. So again, this is what makes me wonder whether you've got some sort of accident has happened to this man, because there is a sight restoration. He has had sight and now it's been put back together again for him. And so like you say, it's not something that makes you, changes what you understand in the story, but there is a sense where you see some extra nuance and depth that's going on there. And it's interesting, this is not a subject area that I've researched at a kind of academic level, John, but it does strike me as interesting that it is when it comes to the healing of people with sight difficulties, that you get this involvement of here Jesus spits. There's another situation where he makes a sort of mud paste, puts it. So I'd love to, one of these days, amongst a long list of things I'd love to get into at a very academic level, would be to actually, I wonder what's going on there as to why it's in the sight miracles that you get an involvement of Jesus spitting, forming, creating. There's something, you talk about the gold, you're scratching and you think there's something more here. I need to keep looking. So that's not very helpful, I realize, to our listeners to know that I'm not quite sure where we go with that. But it feels to me like there's resonances happening for Jesus.
Love that. And I think, to me, David, it seems so. If we're going to sort of celebrate this amazing miracle, remembering some of the things we said in our previous episode, messianic signs, which this one would be one of those ones that leans into that idea. The fact that you've got people on the margins. Now, here's a man who would have maybe had to beg for a living, now being empowered, but also this sort of beautiful nuance of empathy takes him outside the village, and it's not a sensationalist, everyone look at this guy while I do this. It's this quiet, private moment. There's a whole bunch of beautiful stuff going on. But it seems to me, again, one of the things we did in the parables together, David, was we tried to see statements of Jesus in a wider flow and context. Now, we've already alluded to the bit before, but if we look at Mark 8 in a slightly wider context, this miracle, forgive my language, this miracle sort of becomes meat in a beautiful sandwich almost. It's like, so I know there's a bit of a pun there on bread before. Sorry about that. This is all getting very cringy. So you've got,
I hadn't even noticed that, but that is quite brilliant.
Thank you. So you've got Jesus feeding the 4,000, 7 basketfuls left over. The disciples getting completely the wrong end of the conversation, concluding in this "have you got eyes to see" sort of conversation. Then we have this amazing miracle, and then we're back to the disciples.
Yes.
And it's like you've got disciples before, miracle in the middle, and then another disciples story.
Yes.
And these three feel profoundly connected to me.
Well, if you've tracked what we were saying about Luke and Isaiah 35, and that the Messiah will bring certain signs with him that help you know he's the Messiah, there's almost the kind of quiz question, John, isn't there? That, do you have eyes to see? Well, here's a man who may not have had eyes, and Jesus has just healed, and now the man can see clearly. So if you were the teacher, if you're the rabbi, as Jesus is, and you've got your disciples, as he has, as you walk away from that situation, right? So, because that's the next line. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. The question is, so what do you now ask? Because this is what rabbis do. They do things, and then they say to the disciples, so what do you think about this? What is the question that you turn to your disciples and ask at this point? And it's right there in the text, isn't it?
It's right there in the text. Who do people say I am? Shall I read this little bit for our listeners? Because I think it's so cool. Verse 28, they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Now, again, in my Bible, there's a pause there.
Yes.
But with your permission, I'm going to keep going for a few more verses.
I was going to say, hold it for a second, right? Okay. I don't know if that's me now removing my permission. But I think it's worth to pause at this point and ask this question. Is Peter right? Okay. So is Peter right? Now, we don't necessarily need to answer that question, but if you're listening to this, or maybe you're out for your run right now, or you're driving your way to work. So who do people say I am? Well, some people say John the Baptist, other Elijah, still one of the prophets. There's a lot of rumors, Jesus, about what people are saying about you. Okay, but you've been with me for a while now. You've just seen me heal this guy with no eyes. You remember Isaiah 35. Who do you say that I am? Peter says, you're the Messiah. And I think it's worth just holding that question for a second. It's going to sound hugely controversial. But if you listen to it, wait a minute, what is David saying? But is Peter right? Okay, so hold that and then, jump back into the text now.
Okay, so verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." That's a bit of a twist right there. Bit of a turn in the story within that. So again, this trajectory. So let's remind ourselves of the trajectory. They've been talking about bread. Jesus then warns them about the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. They get the whole thing mixed up. He's saying, do you have eyes to see? We now have this miracle of a man potentially having new eyes created in his head. And then the very next conversation is, who do people say I am? And this awkward moment with Peter, where it seems to turn in the wrong direction as far as he's concerned.
Like, thank God for Peter. Right? So Peter is like, he's got to surely be the patron saint of those with their foot in their mouth. And as somebody who quite regularly puts my foot in my mouth, and maybe that's that metaphor that we use in the UK, isn't it? About just when you say that thing that you probably shouldn't have said. Jesus spoke plainly to them about what it meant for him to be the Messiah. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. That word is elsewhere used in the gospel for how you speak to demons, right? Incredible. So when you see Jesus doing what he does to demons, that's the same word. So, I mean, goodness me, that's tough,
that is
isn't
strong.
it? And in case you missed it, that's what's happening. Jesus turns around and then does the same thing back to Peter and says, "Get behind me." And then he uses this phrase. This is this Hebrew word for the tempter, the evil one, the accuser. Like, this is a big, we naturally think about the devil and we immediately have an image in our mind. But in the Hebrew culture, this is this very shadowy, strange character. Isn't Satanas is not someone to be messed with, but definitely this evil sort of thing that Jesus sort of places upon him. But I think it's worth knowing that the word literally means the tempting one. So get behind me, you tempter, says Jesus to Peter. That's going to need a little unpacking, I think, as we go through this. But let me go back to my question, John, for a second. You are the Messiah, says Peter. Is Peter right? Okay. And I want to give the game away just early because, as we've said a few times, that Two Texts is not a mystery podcast where we'll reveal everything at the end. But if you're reading this, or you can just remember, just scroll back a little bit to just what happened with the miracle that led just previous to this. So Jesus spits in the man's eye sockets, puts his hand on him, and says, "Do you see anything?" I see people, they look like trees walking around. So let me ask you a question that's not in the text. Can the man see? Right? So let's just play the role out for a second, John. So if I say to you, at this point in this story, can the man see? What's your response?
Yeah, he can see, but clearly not clearly. He's seeing something, but he's not seeing what he needs to see.
So 100%. So you almost go kind of. It's your answer. I think I don't want to say no, but if people look like trees, then I don't want to say yes either. Right? And I think this is where you start to see the genius of Mark. Right?
So good.
Who do people say that I am? Peter says, "You're the Messiah." Is Peter right? And on one level, let me just remove all the tension for our listeners. Yes, Peter is right. Okay.
He is right.
But then when Jesus starts to unpack what it means to be the Messiah, Peter takes Jesus aside and rebukes him like a demon, right? At which point you realize when Peter said, "You're the Messiah," whatever Peter's image of what the Messiah was doesn't line up with Jesus's image of what the Messiah is when he teaches about it. A friend of mine, Paul Gibbs, tells a story about the day that he proposes to his wife, right? And he says that, "I asked my wife to marry me, and she said yes. But I realized after many years that what we both were thinking we were talking about was different things." Looking at it from the outsiders, everybody was agreeing to what was going on here. And it's almost that, and I love that little image. I've used it a few times, I've stolen it from Paul. That's exactly, Peter says, yes, you are the Messiah, as long as I get to define what a Messiah is.
Indeed.
But when Jesus starts to define what the Messiah is, then it's not quite correct, is it? It's out of sync. So Jesus then has this challenge with Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but just human concerns. And then he says, and move it on to Mark 8:34, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet give up their very being? And what can anyone give in exchange for their being? So you get part 2. And what I like to try and do with these 2 stories, so you have the story of the man potentially with no eyes, and you have this story now of Jesus and Peter's question about, is he the Messiah? Lie them next to each other, and I think you see the genius of Mark, the storyteller. Now, you have a man, can he see? Well, he can kind of see, right? But he needs a second intervention from Jesus to clarify, now you can see properly. Now we go over to the disciples. Are they right that Jesus is the Messiah? Well, yes, they are, but kind of not, because they're still holding on to their ideas of what the Messiah is. So Jesus comes in for a second round, and you pointed out the language. It's just brilliant. Jesus, that he teaches these things plainly to them. He's trying to move them into full sight.
Amazing. And what, I mean, I think what an encouragement and help that is to all followers of Jesus, or anyone seeking to engage with Jesus, is that like Peter sometimes, metaphorically, and like this man literally, we can see men like trees walking. We think we see God, we think we see Jesus, and to an extent we are seeing Jesus, and yet that must lead us further. We must never stop and go, well, no, I see. I mean, imagine had the man who had been blind, imagine if he had said, yeah, it's fine, I see, everything's cool. Yeah. Then he would have walked around thinking humans look like trees.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So he can see, but he can't see clearly, which is the whole, again, double nuance of the text, isn't it? Have you got eyes to see is the previous question. And then he saw clearly. And then you've got Jesus explaining clearly. So that there's this idea, listen, if you just settle for men as trees walking, you're going to miss the real thing. Are you the Messiah? Yes, of course you are the Messiah. Absolutely you are. But if Peter stays there, he ends up seeing a Messiah that's like a tree walking instead of the real, true, life-changing Messiah. My goodness, what a challenge that is to me. In my own relationship with Jesus, I don't want to settle for my version of him. I don't want to settle for my tree walking version of Jesus. I go, Lord, yes, I do see. There's some stuff I do see, but help me see more. Help me see clearly. Help me get really you and not my definition of you, or not my personal preference of you. And I think, seriously, there will be some of our listeners, and I guarantee it, David, I'm guaranteeing it, or their money back, right?
For this free podcast.
Absolutely. That when they listen to this and see those 3 stories put together, the beautiful story of the healing and the what comes before and what comes after, and they put those together, their jaws will hit the floor. Because again, it's leading into this idea, not only is Jesus healing people, and not only is this a sign of his messiahship, but there is profound layers of messaging going on to his called community to really not just look at the miracle, wow, wouldn't it be cool to lay hands on someone and grow eyeballs?
Yes.
And absolutely, that would be cool. But that isn't the only point of all of this. It's, hey, do you see? Can you see who I am? And will you deny yourself in the scene of that scene? Oh, David, that's just, seriously, that is so good.
Think about the narrative, and there's a lot of things to say about this, but Jesus says, okay, let me unpack what a Messiah is then. And Peter's sitting there, and Peter's going, nah, I'm not on board with this. This is not what I signed up for. So he has he feels that he has the ability to go to Jesus and rebuke him. Right?
Amazing.
I mean, that's
incredible.
Quite something. But therein lies the discipleship warning. So my take on the Gospels is that while they're telling us about Jesus, they're also telling us how to be good disciples of Jesus.
So good.
So it's almost like there's this warning. Be careful of forcing Jesus into your box that you have for him. This is what I'd like Jesus to be like. And I would say you can see that across lots of Christianity. Let me pick on some low-hanging fruit for a second. But I think about that with like the prosperity gospel messages. I would like to be wealthy and comfortable. Well, wouldn't we all? Right? Like, let's not try and pretend that I'm pious here, for example. It would be lovely to not worry about money. But what can happen is I can then say, oh, and I think that's what God wants me for. That's what God wants for me too. So let me squeeze my image of Jesus in and now proclaim a Jesus that just wants you to be rich and happy, right? Yeah. And we're going to be careful about that because you're now going to move. What is it Jesus says to Peter? You've got the wrong things in mind. You've got human things in mind, and God's trying to do God's things here. So I would say it would be very normal for me or any of our listeners to go, it'd be nice to have a little bit more money. And that's fine. I don't even think that's an ungodly thing to think. It would be nice to have a little bit more money. But when I start trying to leverage Jesus and teach him and present him and live him out and only be satisfied with him when he does that for me, then I'm now getting into, I'm trying to overwhelm God's agenda with my own agenda. And I think that that's a danger for me, John, on a pretty daily basis, that I would like God to be a little bit more like I would like him to be.
And listen, if we're all going to be honest, and I'm sure the people connecting with our podcast, if you're serious as a follower of Jesus, we're all admitting to that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, we have all made him in our image, or we've all wanted him to be a bit more like sympathetic to my cause.
Yes.
And maybe less insistent on his.
And maybe less sympathetic to other people's causes as well.
Indeed.
I'd like him to be more graceful to me and a little angrier with everybody else.
Of course. And I think you see Jesus wrestle with his lovely young disciples, call down fire from heaven and burn them up moments. It's all going on there. And he manages the extremity, the polarization, the division, the pain within his own society that is literally being manifest in the lives of these young disciples that he's now leading and developing and growing and trying to help them see. So theologically, forgive me, listeners, for theologically spitting in their eye, essentially. He wants them to see something that they are struggling to see. And they're not struggling to see it because they're bad. They're struggling to see it because that's what they've been taught they should see.
Yeah.
And they've been conditioned to seeing the world a certain way. I often repeat this in a slightly different context, but as humans, we often see the world as we are, not as it is. So it's just amazing. I'm male, I'm heterosexual, I'm white, I'm Western. So I'm all the time having to recognize that I'm seeing my world through all of those lenses, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but of course it can become bad when that's the only lens I choose to look through. And 100%. Being a follower of Jesus, of course, I have to bring my whiteness, my maleness, my westernness, everything that I am, and I have to filter that through him, or even to use our miracle, allow him to create some new eyeballs in me and help me to see something I've never seen before.
And that's a beautiful part of the story as well. So just think about the ridiculousness of it. You guys, do you not even get what's going on here? Do you have eyes but you don't see? And let's have this little miracle story. Okay, so who do you think I am? Well, we think you're this. Yeah, well, that's fine if you think I'm this. This is what this means. Messiah means this. Okay, no, we're not okay with that. So Peter, I'm going to rebuke you, Jesus. And Jesus, in a very harsh exchange, rebukes Peter. Get behind me, Satan. Because interesting, and notice this, by the way, it just struck me just now, John. Terrible presenting for him to bring something, and I've only just noticed. Peter takes Jesus aside. Remember, the man was taken aside privately from the village. Peter takes Jesus aside privately, but Jesus turns around and readdresses the disciples. So Peter takes Jesus aside privately and rebukes him. But Jesus turned, looks at his disciples and rebukes Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God and merely human concerns. But then, and I think this is beautiful, and then that's it dealt with, right? Mm-hmm. So then he gathers everybody back around himself again. Peter's not outcast, right? Peter's not, and just like, I don't want to, we're going to do Mark 9 as part of this season, so I don't want to give too much away. But the next story, Jesus takes Peter and one other disciple into a beautiful moment in the presence of God.
Indeed.
Who verses before he said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Like, if ever you want a model for how to disciple people, is let your disciples make mistakes. But don't then, he doesn't get like sort of put on the naughty list. He doesn't, right, Peter, you're at the back of the class. John, you're number one now. Let's go with Andrew. Nobody hears about him much. Thaddeus. He doesn't do any of that. Peter is allowed to do that. And there's two things about how do we model our Christianity to others. I'm going to follow Jesus. People are going to come to me perhaps and look for guidance. They're going to make mistakes. Like, there's a question for us as the church. How do we navigate when people make mistakes? And I don't just mean church leaders. I mean, how do we in the community? Like, I have lived in communities where, and worked in Christian communities and been part of Christian communities. Someone's marriage has fallen apart. And even though theologically the church are okay with that, and pastorally the church can say these things happened, the community have turned on each other and started drawing sides. And here you have Peter telling Jesus in the language of how you cast out demons, I don't like what you're saying. And Jesus doesn't sideline him. And then there's that other level to that is, I have as a pastor had people say to me, yeah, but if I said this to God, surely God wouldn't forgive me. And there's this beautiful sense of, well, Peter talked to Jesus like he was a demon. And Jesus forgave him for it. Jesus moved on from it. And in fact, took him into this incredible series of experiences afterwards. Like, it's all there in the text, John, isn't it, for us?
So rich. It's so powerful. And I think hopefully for us as followers of Jesus, and hopefully for those that listen to this, it's recognizing, to use a well-worn motif, that walking with Jesus is a journey. It is a pilgrimage. It's not you get everything downloaded to your spirit at the start and you've got it all. But actually, though we are transformed, we are learning, we are changing, we are growing. Yes. We are progressing from seeing trees that are like men like trees walking to actually seeing clearly. And what a beautiful thing that is. That's a hope for us all, that the Lord doesn't cast us off, but he takes us on a journey and is patient with us until we ourselves can see clearly. So what a beautiful, magnificent, glorious story with nuance either side of the miracle. And so much to teach us about not only the work of Jesus, but following Jesus. Just love it. Beautiful.
Again, Richard Hayes has this little comment, and he says this: Mark has placed this odd little episode immediately before the pivotal conversation at Caesarea Philippi in order to signal that the disciples are about to undergo the process of having their vision healed, but gradually, rather than all at once. Beautiful. And so it's a sense of be patient with yourself. Yeah. Jesus is working, and he's doing big work. Jesus is, look at what he says in verse 34. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So the cross of Jesus is going to be what defines how we live and how we behave as followers of Jesus. It's so contrary to what we're expecting and understanding. And I love this idea that Jesus is patient with us in that.
Yeah, beautiful.
And there's so much rush so often, I think. Yeah. I've encountered this so many times in my experience of church life, that we want everything now. And we not only for ourselves, but for others. Well, that person's decided to follow Jesus. Why are they still struggling with X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
Well, you could be hanging around with Jesus for a long time and see a lot of miracles and still not quite understand what it means for him to be the Messiah and the Christ. And Jesus is patient with that.
Absolutely.
I just think it's fantastically beautiful that we can take this. In fact, the whole of the chapter, just to read, that Jesus can provide food and Jesus can heal the person who is blind. And yet at the end of the chapter, Jesus says, yeah, but what good is it if you gain the whole world and then lose your, and the Greek word is psyche there, like your whole, it's often translated soul, but I think that's too reductionist, but lose your whole being, lose who you are. And Peter's almost wanting to challenge Jesus. No, don't like the way you do that. And Jesus is saying, yeah, but there's more to this than the way you're seeing it. It's so deeper. It's just, I think then that what we see is that, and why I think it's helpful to jump into this passage here, is that we're getting a bigger lens then as to how Jesus is setting out his miraculous ministry as a guide for us, while also caring about the marginalized and the oppressed.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And just as we're drawing this to a close, really, what came across my mind as you were just speaking there was Paul's prayer for the church at Ephesus. I pray that you will have the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you will know him more. And that's our hearts, isn't it? As we've talked together, as we've shared together, as we've journeyed together, we just want to know him more, and we don't want anything, whatever that anything is, to get in the way of seeing who he is, seeing what he can do, and seeing him formed in us.
Okay, that's it for this episode. If you want to get in touch with either of us about something we said, you can reach out on podcast@twotext.com or by liking and following the Two Text podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a review on your podcast app or said hi on one of our social media sites. And if you really enjoyed this podcast, why not share it with a friend? Don't forget, you can listen to all our podcasts at twotext.com or wherever it is that you get podcasts from. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time, so until then, goodbye from us.